Good afternoon. My name is Snyder, and I'm from the University of Florida. And I feel like I've been set up beautifully by the previous two presenters because I'm not an anthropologist, but I'm majoring in history. So I'm coming at this from a different perspective, and I'm actually going to be talking about a dissenter for my presentation. So it's entitled, The Fist of Lazaro is the Fist of His Generation, Lazaro, Saavedra, and New Cuban Art as Dissidence. So, memory is a weapon against the blood and shit of history, that propaganda of the victors, that frozen wasteland. This stanza recognizes the fundamental reality in Cuba that there exists a disparity between history and memory, the official representation and the actual. These words characterize the philosophy of the New Cuban artists who, beginning in the 1980s and continuing through the special period until today, used art to search for a culture of truth in the midst of the ideological rubble they see every day, in their hearts and in their houses. Lazaro Saavedra is one such artist who has used his work to express the problems and experiences of ordinary humans, professing independence from the state's creative historical narrative and dogma. My paper sought to elucidate the messages of three pieces of Saavedra's work and locate them within the framework of memory and its purposes. However, for the purposes of this presentation, I will be looking at two, Sepultados por el Olvido and Seremos como Atue. Saavedra's works embody a subversion of the regime's official historical narrative for the goal of recovering the true nature of Cuban identity. That is, through art, he advocates living in the truth of the collective rather than remaining under the enforced position of the regime. I contend that Saavedra rejects the regime's management of ideas in order to challenge the legitimacy of the state, create spaces for discussion, and advocate for the recovery of an alternative memory. Lazaro Saavedra, the rough and ready philosopher of Cuban life, understood the power of ideas and possibilities of a changed conscience. He graduated from the Instituto Superior de Artes in Vienna in 1988, comprising the second wave of new artists, dubbed Los Novísimos. Unlike most of the artists with whom he grew up, Saavedra remained in Cuba throughout the 1990s and still lives there today, continuing to create work as an attitude, ethic, and strategy of life. This makes Saavedra unique. His long-standing presence among Cuban artists speaks to his ability to create works that forge relationships with ongoing social, political, and ethical issues, and maintain the stamina to dissent. The weight of importance he gives to cognitive functions, both his as the artist and that of the public, should not be overlooked, for it is the crux of his purpose. The first work we turn to is Sepultados por el Olvido, or Buried by Forgetfulness, which featured unmarked tombstones placed in front of a bullet-pocketed wall that was well known locally as the unmarked site of the executions that had culminated Che's revolutionary tribunals of Batistianos in 1959. It was an installation at the 1997 Havana Biennial, themed The Individual and His Memory. The biennial intended to propose a tension between individual memory and memory as a social and historical repository, but many of the works lapsed into a family photo album approach suffused with inchoate learning. Saavedra's did not. His piece blatantly commemorated an event that people only remembered privately, but that was publicly forgotten. The Castro regime, in its quest to gloriously paint Che as a symbol of the revolution, conveniently forgot about this little piece of history. Omitting it from official remembrance rendered the executions to seem as if they had never happened in the first place. The historical memory of Cuba, then, is one created for political purposes. It does not align with the collective memory. Collective memory can be understood as lived experiences, in contrast with historical memory, which is the preserved narrative, often the official. If collective memory ultimately is located not in sites but in individuals, there is a danger of the collective becoming the historical if individuals fail to act on recognizing the difference. Saavedra's graveyard was a call to remember and act upon that remembrance. Otherwise, society would eventually be buried by the regime's narrative instead of that of the collective. Saavedra advocated living in the truth. While the previous piece of Saavedra's was serious and bitingly critical, much of his artwork is humorous. Humor was a central tenet in the New Cuban art, as laughter was a technique used to subvert the power of the regime and invert existing structures of expression and control. It evidenced itself in a myriad of different ways and for different purposes, including revenge, relief, and simple fun. Laughter has been related less to tragedy than to the grotesque, giving rise to horror and laughter in the same breath. In the case of Cuban art, the grotesque was tied to the choteo, the classic element of Cuban humor, that which perverted the joke and was always making fun of things. The choteo is essentially rebellion, and it abominates humorously every principle of conduct and disciplinary requirement. It ridiculed the difference between what was supposed to be and what actually was. Saavedra's use of the choteo to make fun of the regime's Saavedra used the choteo to make fun of the regime's images, words, and portrayal of reality through sarcasm and irony. Seremos como Atue, we will be like Atue, might best illustrate this idea. In it, Saavedra drew Indians lining up to have their picture taken in a photo cutout board of the Hatui beer label, with a hole for the face replacing that of the Indian chief normally at the center of the brand. Behind the man taking the picture, the actual Indian chief Atue is being burned at the stake. This picture is a parody of Theodore de Brye's famous engraving, The Burning of Atue, which depicts the story of Bartolomé de las Casas wrote about Atue. According to his account, Atue fled from the Spanish line Hispaniola to Cuba, but when he heard the Spanish were then crossing over to Cuba, he assembled his people to fight. Atue and his warriors eventually lost, and he was burned at the stake. He is famously remembered for telling the priest trying to convert him right before being burned that he would rather go to hell if heaven is where the Spanish went. Atue's resistance to the Spanish invasion made him Cuba's first leader of indigenous rebellion against European conquest. Fidel Castro would use the figure of Atue, this legend, and the Indio theme for his own purposes centuries later, adopting him as a national hero and father to the Cuban nation. In a 1985 speech, Castro remarked, "These are no longer the times of El Indio Atue, nor are they the times when, at the end of our independence, there came others to stroll through her opportunistically. Now, we are a conscious people, organized, patriotic, combative, well-prepared, who are afraid of nothing and no one." Castro's imagery in this speech cast Americans as the new Spanish conquistadors, and the Indians as the Cuban people as a whole, fighting off foreign invaders. This time, though, Cuba would avoid defeat and invasion. Through Atue, Castro transformed the Indian into a foreigner who came to fight for the defense of a nation with which he feels some solidarity, an internationalist revolutionary, and a martyr whose blood sacrifice has been transformed into some idea of his life. Such rhetoric essentially bleached the Indian out of Atue, thus allowing Che Guevara, the Argentinian revolutionary, to become his modern-day incarnation. Atue is thus stripped of his Indianness and molded to fit the purposes of Fidel Castro and the revolution. Saavedra's title, Seremos como Atue, connects Che and Atue al Indio as well. It primarily satirizes one of the regime's slogans, Seremos como el Che, we will be like Che, which was said every day by Cuban students as part of their morning ritual before school. Charged with the task of being like el Che, Cuban youth were supposed to reach beyond innate, selfish desires and individual comforts to achieve an impossible utopia founded on voluntarism and the common good, not just temporarily but eternally. However, instead of becoming like El Che, Saavedra changes the slogan to Atue, but in the picture twisted again, referring not to El Indio Atue, but to the beer. With this, Saavedra crushes the regime's idealism and rhetoric. Cubans are not going to be like El Che, and they are not going to embrace the myth that all Cubans are Indians. These myths, Saavedra suggests, are ridiculous and merely empty ideas. The fact that Saavedra drew the picture with colored pencils or crayons to simulate a child's drawing, and completed the effect by signing the piece Lazarito, a child's nickname, emphasizes the hollowness and degree of removal between the revolution's imagery and actuality. This implies that a child could easily mix up Che with Atue, and Atue el Indio with the beer, because beer was more real and familiar than the others. The revolutionary narrative, employing Che and Atue as symbols molded to support the cause, does not, in reality, resonate with Cubans. Thus, Saavedra humorously illustrates the disparity between the charade in which Cubans participate to go along with the regime's historical narrative and what they actually live. Castro attempted to instill a certain consciousness into the Cuban people by employing his vision of figures such as Che and Atue, yet by the 1980s, and certainly by the special period, it fell flat. The regime's failure to respond to the many crises of the special period was a betrayal of the revolution and essentially the Cuban people. illegitimate. The Sabemos como Noche generation was then forced to redefine their identity apart from the state, and they are doing so in ways meant to reevaluate, critique, and improve upon the past. As demonstrated by Sabemos como Noche, Saavedra embedded criticism through funny twists, capitalizing on the Cuban tendency to make fun of things. Yet this intention to profess the truth of reality was not lost. His alternative display of identity challenged what was written and professed by the regime. Saavedra's artwork confronted, and continues to confront, the differences between the official narrative and the reality experienced by normal Cubans. He challenges his audience to seek, recognize, and live in the truth in order to craft their own revolutionary identities apart from the state, which includes defining their memory in contrast to the ones written by the state. Lazaro Saavedra is a revolutionary, yet not one proclaiming the history or slogans of a regime, but of independent thought, memory, and identity. Thank you.